Welcome everybody to the Chess Lab, welcome to episode 4 of Endgame Mastery. We are reading Silman's complete Endgame course, or the complete book. It's just made in digital form. In previous episodes we went through part 1, Endgames for beginners. Then we looked at part 2, Endgames for class E. And then we looked at part 3, which is Endgames for class D. It's time to look at part 4, Endgames for class C. This is going to be a very long chapter, and perhaps class C, class B, class A are the most important chapters, because that's where, in my opinion, your brain really hits the ceiling, your mind makes a breakthrough in your understanding. That's where friction is. So let's start with the introduction as usual. I have my water with me. So, introduction. The need to know endgames becomes a much higher priority once you reach the 1400-1599 range. So, between 1500 and 1600. In the United States, this rating group represents the average tournament player, and this means that you have probably become serious about moving up the ranks. To successfully do that, you'll need to expand your endgame arsenal and master a series of easy-to-learn but critical important positions and concepts. Now it's time to take it to another level, to digest ideas that might appear difficult and even profound, but will turn out to be easy to grasp and remember, once you put a little effort into it, of course. But we are here to put in the effort, we have already done it multiple times, so we are not scared by that, we are actually excited by this. This chapter is far larger than any other chapter in this book. Why? Because a quantum leap in endgame understanding is necessary if one wishes to be a solid Class C player who has aspirations for advancement. Thus, here you'll own the skills already acquired in this book and come face to face for the first time with many of the most important, must-know positions and concepts in chess. So yeah, that's the leap. That's where it happens, guys. That's where it happens. Okay. King and Pawn versus Lone King, part 1. So let's go all the way up. Thus far, we have mastered the opposition and basic King and Pawn versus Lone King theory. If you haven't mastered this material, stop, or this book will self-destruct. Go back to part 3. I woke up at 4, guys. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit tired to go to work. Back to part 3 and catch up. Now we'll hone the king and pawn skills you already possess and give you some new extremely useful tools. What does it mean to hone? Guys, English is not my first language, so I have to search it on Google. Hone translation, traduzione. Traduzione is translation in Italian. Affinare is like I get it what it means in Italian, which is hone, to hone. Yeah, to really bring to perfection, to smooth it in a way. Okay. So, all right. Sharpening. So, now we'll hone the king and pawn skills you already possess and give you some new extremely useful tools. King and pawn versus lone king endgames are, for the most part, pretty simple affairs. In fact, a glance is usually enough to let you know who will own the opposition and whether or not the defending side will be able to set up the basic drawing position. However, there are a few cases where some subtlety is demanded from one or both players. This position is actually quite confusing. If one follows our rules of opposition with king f2, creating a rectangle, let's put it on the board, creating a rectangle whose connection points are f2, f8, you can see the yellow circles, h8 and h2, and take the opposition, then the game will be drawn after king to g7, king to e3, king to f6, when both king f4 and king e4 are met by king e6 with a basic draw. If this doesn't make any sense, run, don't walk to part 3 and read the section of indirect opposition again. Now this makes sense to me. White failed to win this position because he wasn't able to get his king in front of his pawn. So if we go back to the very first position, the move that is correct is actually king to e2. So, tossing immediate thoughts of opposition out the window, the only way to get white's king in front of its pawn is king to e2. This advances the king and moves it away from the enemy monarch. King to g7, of course the most challenging. Black can take indirect opposition through the means of king g8. Of course he puts itself in this rectangle, but it doesn't matter. But this leads to the exact same position as our main line after king d3, king f7, king c4, king e6, king to c5. So instead of king g8, king g7 is chosen, and now king to d3. Since black's king is on the king side, white heads for the queen side so it can avoid the direct confrontation. As seen earlier, king to e3, king f6, king e4, king e6 is an easy draw. This is crazy, guys. So king g7, king to d3, king f6, king c4, king e6, king c5. And we basically transposed one of the previously shown positions from previous chapters. King d7, king to d5, with a basic win for white as seen in part 3. Useful advice: if taking the opposition fails to accomplish the goal of getting the king in front of its pawn, then it's useless to take the opposition in the first place. So an input I want to give is the reason why this is useful is also to have candidate moves, right? And candidate ideas. Like in this position here, you know this concept on going outside of the pawn. So the first thing you calculate is like king f2, but then you see that it just doesn't work. And the second thing you immediately calculate is going around. So these help you. This helps you tremendously, you know. So let's learn this. And so here we have to move. Let's try to calculate it just for the sake of calculation. King e2, king g7, king d3, king f6, king c4, king e6, king c5, king d7, king d5, and that's winning because we have the opposition. Fantastic. So let's just make it on the board. And let's just make it on the board. Okay. So, king and pawn against lone king, part 2. In part 2, we saw that even though white has the opposition, the position is dead wrong. King d7, d6, king d8. The ability to move straight back when the pawn hits the 6th rank is a critical one, as we'll see in a few moments. King e6, king e8, d7, king d8, king d6 is stalemate. So that's pretty simple, we already experienced that. King and pawn versus lone king. We have also learned that when the stronger side's king gets one square in front of its pawn, I have to reread this because I didn't understand at all. We have also learned that when the stronger side's king, in this case white, gets one square in front of its pawn, we are taking it for granted that is a non-rook pawn. The result of the game depends on who has the opposition. White to move wins easy by king d6, but black to move draws by taking the opposition. King e7, d5, and we basically transpose to the previous line. Fantastic. The reason why I do this, you know, this view of the informational is because I know that I've done the variation, you know, when I come back. It's just to mark the variation as complete. I'm too autistic not to do it. Okay, this rule, if the stronger side's king gets one square in front of its pawn, the result of the game, illustrated in part 3, only flounders if the pawn is a rook pawn, or if the pawn is on the 5th rank and its king is on the 6th. King to e8. Black to move seems to be okay, since he can take the opposition by king e8. However, is actually dead lost. d6, king d8, d7. Wait, what? This confuses me. Okay. King e8. Yeah, okay. No, actually it makes sense. This highlights the fact that he can't move straight back as in the position we saw a few moments ago. This means that black should resign after king c7, king e7. Our oft-repeated rule, if the stronger side's king gets one square in front of his pawn, result shockingly turns out to have two exceptions. This can prove confusing to many players, myself first, so look at the differences between the last three examples again and again if need be, until you fully understand what has occurred. Once you have done this, we are ready for our next position. Rule: if the stronger side's king gets one square in front of its pawn, the results of the game depends who has the opposition unless one of two exceptions are present. 1. The game is drawn if the pawn is a rook pawn. 2. If a non-rook pawn is on the 5th and the king is on the 6th, taking the opposition won't save the defender. Okay, that's nice. Ooh. This is just a win. Fantastic. Okay. A quick look might make us believe that the position is draw since black will get the opposition, but a closer examination proves that black won't survive. Yeah, king f5, white can't allow king e8, d7 with a draw. King f7, taking the opposition and stopping white's king from advancing, so far so good, but white's next move will quickly bring black back to reality. Of course, king e8, king e6, king d8, king d7 is completely hopeless, but after king to f7 there is king e5, exactly, and suddenly white pries the opposition away from black, since king g7, taking the diagonal opposition, king e6 is game over. And in general, this geometry of one guy can take the opposition, but there is a pawn, is important. So king f8, because if you go to e8, you get opposition territory, but here there is king e6 anyways. A good try that allows black to hold his breath and pray for a miracle, but king to f6. Well, I would have blundered actually, because I was trying to, in my mind, it was the previous variation, but the pawn is already on the 6th rank. So if I go king e6, king e8 is a draw. So yeah, I'm just tired, I guess. So king f, do not use worst words. So king f6, not miracles today. Of course, king e6. Let's black take the opposition back with king to e8. Yeah, this is my endgame skill, guys. So king f6, but king e8, king e6. King d8, d7, the king is booted out and white wins. Okay. Okay, so we approach, they don't have the opposition, we take it this time, and we easily win with this situation. Okay. I'm drinking my water here. This position is easy since white to move wins by simply marching his king in front of his pawn. King d8. On king e7, king d3, king e6, king e4 leads to a basic win as seen in part 3. The stronger side always wins if his king gets 2 squares in front of his pawn unless it's a rook pawn. So king d8, king d3, king d7, king e4, king e6, but simply e3. And white, with his king in front of his pawn and with the opposition, will have no problems scoring the full point. If there is a problem, go back to part 3 and reread the material. No, actually, this one I remember. This is one of those things that I'm like, yeah, makes sense. Well, here I don't know where he wants to go. It doesn't really matter. One way or the other, we get there. King and pawn versus long king. Okay, let's see. Black to move is quite another matter. Here white is going down. Black to move is quite another matter, and after some mutual finesses, the game turns out to be drawn. King e7. Taking the opposition, the long distance opposition. King to d1. What's this? Has white gone mad? Actually, white is setting a nice trap since he sees that they direct king d2, king e6, king d3, king d5, king e3, king e5 is an easy draw. So king d1, now king to e6, and now king to d2. This is called the triangulation, and whatever black goes, there is opposition. Believe it or not, black only has one way to draw, which is king to d6, which takes distance opposition. King f6, taking the indirect opposition, would blunder king d3, but not king to e3, because then this is a draw, but it would blunder king d3, and after king to e5, white wins, because king e3, obviously. If instead you play king e5, there is king e3. If you play king d5, there is king d3, and on king e5, king e3. If you play king f5, there is king to d3. Not king to e3, because then king to e5, but king to d3, and after king to e5, now king to e3. So let's go back to the actual lines. King d6 saves the day. On king e3 now there is king e5, and on king d3 there is king d5, and this is a draw. Okay, that's fantastic. So this is kind of understandable. So, but as you can see now, to play it is difficult, right? This is actually good to study these things when you're tired, because my ability to remember short-term things is zero right now. I'm too tired for that. So I can't remember what the move was here, believe it or not. No, I actually remember it's king e7, yeah. King e7, and if here, and if here or here, you go here or here. But I guess it doesn't make any difference. Yeah, exactly, it makes no difference, but this is correct. Now they go here. Can I still go up? Yes, what matters is that I do this afterwards. Can I also do this? Yes, what matters is that I do this afterwards. But this is the situation. And now I just get the opposition. Okay. So that's fair enough. Sneaking into a winning king and pawn versus king position. Trebuchet, part 1. By now you should know when a basic king and pawn versus long king position is lost or drawn. Well, don't overestimate myself, Silman. Don't do that. This knowledge allows you to correctly gauge more complex situations where the prospect of pawn exchanges forces you to decide whether the resulting position is favorable to your cause. This kind of position, which can occur with any set of pawns other than rook pawns, with both kings in front of their respective pawns, is known as a trebuchet. There is not much to learn, since a glance will make things pretty clear. Whoever moves is in Zugzwang. He is forced to move away from the defense of his pawn, which will result in an obviously lost king and pawn versus long king situation. Thus, if white has the move, he has to play king h4, and now after king takes f4, with black's king in front of his pawn, he wins. The win is easy. King h3, king to f3, making sure that his king will have full control of the queening square on f1, king h2, f4, king g1, king to e2, and the game is won. Rule: a trebuchet situation is dead loss to the player with the move. Okay. Again, counterintuitive shit, but let's go. Trebuchet 2. Though the fundamental trebuchet position is easy to grasp, being conversant with it allows you an easy plan when faced with what seems to be a tough battle. The position we see here is the kind that sends many players into panic. Who is better? What in the world is going on? Is there anything to grasp onto that will enable us to make a quick and easy assessment? The idea of something definable which can help us understand the right path in seemingly tough positions is an important one, and we'll be searching for such crutches all throughout this book. In the present case, that crutch is our basic trebuchet. After the c-pawn and h-pawn are taken, the result will depend on who can force the other into Zugzwang via trebuchet. Since black's king will be closer to the two center pawns, meaning that he can make first contact, white will end up a loser in the coming battle. So king takes h6, king takes c3, king g5, king d3, the key move. The obvious king d4 will be a game-losing blunder, since after king f5, black will be the one on the side of the trebuchet. But after king d3, the pawn is under attack. You cannot go to f4, because it's controlled, you have to go to f5. So this is forced, but now king d4, boom. And white must part with his pawn. He could resign here, but play could continue. King g4, king takes e4, king g3, king e3, not letting white's king in front of the pawn, king g4, e4. Avoiding the embarrassing king to d2, king f5, and this is a draw. So after king g4 and e4, king g3, king d2, followed by e3 to e1 queen. This example shows us that a firm grasp of the following rule can prove very useful indeed. Rule: in a near upcoming trebuchet position, the side whose king can make first diagonal contact with the enemy pawn can force a winning trebuchet. Okay. We take, and here if we go here we get trebuchet. So let's go here and let's trebuchet the other guy. King and pawn versus king and pawn 1. Okay. So king f7. The only way to draw. King e7 loses, taking the opposition. King f7 or king d7, king f6. But king d7, king to d6, king to e8. If you play king f6, you get check and GG. So after king e8, boom, continuing to use the opposition to push black's king away from the queening square. White can also win by playing e5, king d8, e6, king e8, e7, king f7, king d7. But he plays king e6, king d8, king f7, king d7, e5, and the pawn promotes. Useful advice: you can often solve seemingly difficult situations by steering the game towards the many basic situations you have mastered. Yeah, simplifying it while winning endgame. Great. So king f7, king takes e5, and now king to e7. Taking the opposition and, as seen in part 3, drawing easily. King d5, king d7, e5, king e7, e6, king e8. Black could still lose by king d8, king d6 opposition. King e8, e7, king f7, king d7, etc. King d6, king d8, e7, king e8, king e6 instead with a draw. Okay. Remember, the ability to see whether or not your opponent can gain the opposition in key moments is extremely important. Successful endgame play is impossible without this skill. So the ability to see whether or not you or your opponent can gain the opposition. Okay. King and pawn versus king and pawn part 2. As in the previous position, white to move will still pick up the pawn by king d7. But we'll give black the move here simply because it's more instructive to do so. Unfortunately for the second player, black now loses even though it appears he can get the opposition. So king f8, the best try since it allows black to take the opposition after white devours the e-pawn. There is no hope at all after king e8, king takes e6, king f8, king d7, when the pawn quickly turns into a queen. However, after king f8 there is king takes e6, and after king to e8, king to d6, king d8. Doesn't black have the opposition, but we said that in this very situation it doesn't matter. e6. No, it doesn't. Suddenly black is the one who must move. King e8 and now e7. And he's not able to use the move the king straight back rule since he is run out of the board. After king f7, king d7, the game would end quickly. What happened? It looked like black should have drawn, but somehow he failed to do so. This position should help to clarify black's previous failure. In the previous position, black's king was not able to step backward after the pawn reached d6, and as a result is lost. Here though, black draws easily since he can step backwards and take the opposition at will. King e8, king d6, king d8, king d5, king e7, king e5, king e8, king f6, king f8, and after e7 you go back, and it's not black to move, so king e6 is stalemate. Okay. My eyes are literally closing. Okay. Studying endgames is really, it's difficult, but notice something, guys, if I can give my input. If you have been following these videos, which I don't think anyone has, but if you're watching this for whatever reason, notice that, like, in these videos I'm often tired. Like right now I'm tired. I would love to do anything rather than this, trust me, like anything. But, you have to build blocks. And moments like this, when you don't feel like doing it, this is where you really build. Because your competition, the other guys, when they don't feel like studying these lines, they just don't do that. And these little moments then compounds eventually. So you study them and you win. That's just simple as that. So, okay, king and two double pawns versus long king always win. Unless the pawns can't be properly defended or unless they are rook pawns. The defender's only hope lies in winning one of the two pawns or in tricking the opponent into some lucky stalemate. Thus, when you have this two-pawn advantage, be very careful to avoid stalemate by making sure the enemy king always has a legal move. Rule: if the pawns are healthy and not rook pawns, king and two pawns versus a long king always win. King f3. Black to move draws immediately by king g4 when the g3 pawn is lost. The result The resulting king and pawn versus long king position is helplessly drawn, which, if you are reading this section, you should be well aware of. White to move is a different story. King f3, king f5, g4, king g5, king g3. White does best to play this endgame as if it were a king and pawn versus long king situation. His extra pawn will come into effect later when a key tempo move is needed. King g6, king f4, king f6, check, king g6, king g7. Opposition, check, king g7, king g8, is opposition, but black, by following the drawing formula for a king and pawn versus long king position, has done the best he could. If white didn't have the extra g-pawn, then the game would now be drawn after, for example, g7, king g8, king g6. And this is a draw, right? If this pawn wasn't here. However, white does have the extra pawn, and this makes all the difference. So in this position here, you play g7 check, king g8, and now you move this pawn up so that this king can slide. G3. This move in effect says, excuse me, but could you kindly move your king away from the front of my pawn? King h7, king f7, and white simply wins. Okay, that seemed simple enough, but why didn't white push both his g-pawns down the board at the same time? The answer is that doing so would increase black's chances for a stalemate, as illustrated in the next example. Let's see the next example. In our previous example, white only touched his extra g-pawn at the end. However, he could have pushed both, which might have led to this position. White still wins, but he has to be careful. g7, king g8, g5, king h7, g8 equals queen. Whoa, I wasn't finding it. Forced but adequate. Instead, king f7 draws by stalemate. Note how the advanced g-pawn restricts the movement of the enemy king and thus turns into a traitor. After g8 equals queen, white forces a winning king and pawn versus long king position. King takes g8, opposition, king h8, king h7, g7 check, and is gg. Useful advice: when you possess as king and two double pawns versus long king, don't push both pawns up the board together, since that increases the weaker side chances for a lucky stalemate. Okay, that's nice. So we give a check, and now we move up here. Now we promote to a queen, and then we give this stalemate situation. I mean, not stalemate, sorry. We promote. Okay, so now there is rook pawn. This has been 30 minutes now. Let me see how much I've done. I want to have done at least a little bit. So 16, 32, 64. Let's do at least 16 lines. So it's a quarter. So at least in four episodes we should be done with it. Let's do it. I don't want to take forever with this. So now let's talk about rook pawn. In general, in a king and pawn versus long king position, the weaker side loses if he can't get his king in front of the enemy pawn. If you can't block and stop the pawn from queening, then you're a goner. However, rook pawns often allow all sorts of exceptions due to the fact that there isn't a file to the side of the pawn, which creates many odd stalemate possibilities. If black king stood on h8 and white's on h6, so if the black king is in the corner and white king is opposite to it, then the game will be an easy draw, since the pawn won't ever be able to get past the blocking defensive king without giving stalemate. In the diagrammed position, though, the black king isn't blocking anything. In fact, white's king has a firm grasp of the critical h8 queening square and has no way of stopping h4, h5, h6, h7, h8 queen. Thus, he might as well resign. Fair enough. If white had the move, he will simply play king g7 and force resignation. However, black to move draws with either king f8 or king f7. Let's take a look. King f7, keeping white's king cornered and thus forcing it to block his own pawn. h5, of course, king h8, king g6, followed by king h5 and king takes h4 ends things differently. So h5, king f8, actually king f6 would also draw, since king to g8, king g5 picks up the pawn, while h6, king f7 takes us back into safe territory. Careful though, in general the defender wants to keep his king on f8 and f7, which allows him to leap to g8 if allowed. So king to f8, king to h8. By now you should know that the position after king to g6, king g8 is obviously drawn. So king h8, king to f7, h6, king to f8. Even faster is king g6, h7, king f7, stalemate, this time by black, who is the weaker side, so it's fine. King f8, white's king is caught in a net and can't clear a path for his pawn. King h7, you might have noticed that h7, king f7 leads to an immediate stalemate and a draw. But after king h7, simply king f7, not letting the snared king out its cage. King h8, king f8, king h7, king f7, stalemate. Well, it's not stalemate, but it's repetition. This is a rare example of the side with no pieces left stalemating the stronger side's king. Well, we saw it previously in the previous examples. So we corner the king, we stay on f8, we just follow them, and we are good to go. Okay, let's keep going. Taking the previous position and adding a second or even third h-pawn has absolutely no effect on the result. This strange position is a dead draw, despite the fact that white is no less than 3 pawns ahead. So for example, king f7, h6, king f8, king h8. Just as useless is king g6, king g8. When black just moves his king back and forth between h8 and g8 until white finally stalemates him. So king f8, king h8, king f7, h5, king f8, h4, king f7. Notice black's subtle defensive maneuvers. I don't know if this is ironic or not. King h7, king f8, king h8. Again, king g6, king g8 is nothing. And king h8, king f7, h7, king f8, h6, king f7, h5, king f8. Stalemate. The final position deserves a diagram. This position should once and for all burn the lessons we have explored concerning rook pawns deeply into your brain. It does. Don't worry, it does. Okay, so you guys, hopefully you are following this. It's really complex, but also, it makes sense. I'm definitely going to review concepts here in the future, but let's just keep rolling for now. This position should make it easy to know whether or not a king and rook pawn versus long king position is drawn. If the defender's king stands on any of the squares with a red circle, the game will be a draw. The position of white's king won't change the result. Okay. Alright. Let's view this, continue, exit. Entering the square of the pawn, okay. Boom. In this position, it starts here. When an enemy pawn is trying to outrace your king down the board, it's always nice to be able to see with a glance if you or your opponent can draw. Sadly, most players feel that they must do the old he goes there and I go there routine for an endless series of moves to see if their king can make it back in time to stop an unescorted enemy pawn. Fortunately, there is an easier way. This position, in which white's king is far from the action, poses a simple question. Can black's king stop or even win the enemy pawn? The game hangs in the balance. If the black king can stop the pawn, the game is drawn, while the game is lost if the king can't. The answer lies in a technique called the square of the pawn. In this position, the normally invisible square of the pawn is drawn and clear for all to see. How does one create such a square? Here's the trick, in the direction of the stalking king. Draw a diagonal extension from the pawn to the end of the board. Draw a rank extension from the side of the pawn to the file where the diagonal extension ended. In this case, that would be the E file, since the diagonal extension ended at E8. Connect all the lines and you get the square in the diagram. Rule: if black's king can step into this square, it will stop the pawn. If it can't, the pawn will run for a touchdown. So whoever has the move here actually achieves this goal. So A5. However, if it was white to move, now we can see at a glance that black's king can indeed step into this square and thus stop the pawn. A5. However, if it was white to move, a5 is a winner because a new square would be created. a5 is a winner because a new square would be created. Even if it's his move, black can't step into this new square and thus can't stop the pawn. If all this seems confusing, think about it, try to move the king towards the pawn on your own board and imagine the square shrinking each time the pawn moves. After a bit of time, the whole square of the pawn idea will be an easy and natural part of your chess arsenal. Okay, that's fair enough. So outside passed pawns. How many lines we have done? 19 lines, perfect, 19 lines. So I'd say that we can stop here. And tomorrow we can start with outside passed pawns. Okay, let's just explore the titles of this chapter to see what's going on. Outside passed pawns, minor piece endgames, whoa. Bishop and wrong colored rook pawn versus lone king, that's crazy. This starts to become quite complex. Then there is lone king versus knight and rook pawn on the 6th or 7th. That's crazy. I don't even understand what that means. Bishop of opposite colors. The rook. Oh, rook endgames. Oh, the Lucina position. That's crazy. That's crazy. It's already here. The Philidor position. Wow. Wow. Pure Philidor. Trap the enemy king away from the action. Queen versus king and pawn. These are very complex. These are difficult, man. Oh, these are difficult. Summing up and then tests. How many tests are there? $14 tests. That's crazy. Yeah, this is a tough chapter, but guess what? Sorry. Let's do it like this. This is a tough chapter, but guess what? We are here for that reason. So I can't wait to also face this chapter here. Okay. Today's video is just 42 minutes, I see on my recording software, but that's fine. I started late. Also, you need to understand, guys, before I do these videos, I study my openings, you know, that always goes on. So I'm not fresh when I start to study these. I wouldn't be fresh anyways, but you know what I mean. Okay, so for this 4th episode of Endgame Mastery, it's all. Thank you so much for watching, waiting for you to face episode 5. Thanks again, enjoy your chess.